It's not meat that made us human. It's not plants that made us human. It's not fire that made us human. The role that food processing or our ability to take a broad spectrum of foods played in human evolution is it allowed us to expand, right? So I think that sort of what makes us human in terms of diet is our ability to take a and you mentioned a narrow spectrum of foods. I would disagree. I would say that we've got an incredibly broad potential diet compared to any other primate species in the world, compared to almost any species as it is. Our ability to take a very broad spectrum of foods is what allowed us to take over the world. How could we leave Africa? How could we go to the Arctic? How could we go to the Antarctic? How could we go to the equator if we didn't have the ability to find something to eat there? Different foods are available in different places, and our incredible ability to take a broad spectrum of food items, I believe, is one of the keys to our success. It's what makes us human.
Today, I have with me Dr. Peter Ungar, a PhD in anthropology from Stony Brook University. Dr. Ungar has taught at Johns Hopkins University and Duke, and is now director of environmental dynamics at the University of Arkansas. He's written or co-authored over 200 scientific studies focusing on diet in primates, as well as reconstructing the diet of our human ancestors. Dr. Ungar, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So to start off with, the main overarching question of this whole series is, what foods did humans evolve to eat? How can we begin answering that question?
Well, it's a tough question to answer. For me, the best way to address it is to look at the fossil record for human evolution and try and reconstruct the diets of our ancestors using their teeth, mostly, but also analogy with living primates and living traditional peoples.
And you focus mainly on the dental wear, the dental microwear. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, dental microwear it's called dental microwear. These are the microscopic scratches and pits that form on a tooth surface as a result of its use. But dental microwear is just one of a new category of what we call proxies, or bits of evidence for diet in fossil species. These lines of evidence actually are like footprints in the sand. I call them food prints, traces of actual activities of once living organisms. They include things like the scratches that form on the teeth as a result of chewing, the chemistry in the teeth and bones that results from the foods that are used to build those teeth and bones, and little bits of food that are occasionally trapped in the tartar on teeth that we find in the fossil record. So this sort of contrasts with the more traditional method of reconstructing diet, which is looking at the sizes and the shapes of the teeth, which tell you something about what animals in the past were capable of eating, but not what they actually ate on a daily basis. These traces of past behavior, I think, are what's going to give us the lines of evidence for what was actually eaten by individuals in the past. And dental microwear, as you alluded to already, is the pattern of scratches and pits on teeth or in teeth that result from what foods are being eaten, and different foods leave different patterns. If we can figure out how to read those patterns, then we can say something about the diets of the individuals whose fossil teeth we hold in our hands. And if we can look through the human fossil record over time, we can look and talk about how diet has changed over time.
And from this dental microwear, can we predict how much of each type of foods humans ate? I know in some previous interviews that I've had with other experts, they've told me that it's really difficult to figure out quantity. It's easier to find out what they ate rather than the quantity. Is that true?
Yes, the kinds of information that each of these proxies can give us differs. And dental microwear can tell you if an animal ate soft foods, if an animal ate tough foods like grasses or leaves or meat, if an animal ate really hard foods like nuts or crunched bone or something like that. And you can't figure out exactly how much was eaten. But if, say, you've got 20 individuals and 15 of them or 18 of them look like they had a tough diet, and you combine that with other lines of evidence, that can tell you that, for example, most of the individuals in the species ate grass most of the time. And basically the way that this works is if you crush hard foods, envision or imagine a hammer hitting an anvil. When that happens, you create pitting in the anvil from the hammer. So if you crush hard foods, if you force your teeth together, that's going to create pits. Whereas if you slice tough foods, let's say you have a pair of scissors and you're trying to slice a tough leaf or a sheet of paper that's tough, what happens is the blades from the scissors scrape past one another and they go in sort of the same direction. And the abrasives on the paper, or if it's a food, on the food in or on the leaves, get dragged along that surface as the blades slide past one another. And that causes long linear scratches. So crushing hard foods, pits. Shearing or slicing through tough foods, scratches. You can actually look at the percentage of pits to scratches to say something about diet. And if you've got 20 individuals, and all 20 of them look pitted up, you can be pretty convinced that that fossil species was a hard object feeder, ate nuts or bone. Whereas if it's 50-50, probably had a pretty broad diet that included both tough and brittle foods, hard foods. If they're all filled with scratches, probably no hard foods in the diet. So this is a way of getting at things like how broad the diet was in the past.
Got it. Are there any other proxies that you specifically study?
Well, my colleagues and I mean, one of the other proxies that I'm sort of known for is looking at the sizes and the shapes of the teeth to tell us something about what the species evolved to consume. So for example, if the teeth are large and they're filled with lots of high crests, they were probably used for shearing and slicing through a lot of tough vegetation, because you have to eat a lot in order to satisfy your nutritional needs, because tough vegetation tends to be low quality, not a lot of calories. If, on the other hand, your teeth are small and blunt, nuts were more likely your diet. So when we combine the microwear with the morphology, that can tell us both what an animal evolved to eat and what it ate on a daily basis. And the fun part comes when the two are not in sync, when you get different results from the different proxies, as it were. Now, I also study, along with colleagues, some of these other proxies like isotopes. Isotopes are really very valuable, especially carbon in the fossil record, because they can tell us, for example, if an animal is eating tropical grasses and sedges, or animals that eat tropical grasses and sedges, or if an animal is eating bush and tree products. That's especially important for human evolution, because it tells us whether that animal was out on the open savanna or still living in the forest, depending upon whether it was eating grass products or tree products.
Now, like you said, are there times where you have, for example, the dental microwear and the teeth size and shape that differs from gut morphology or acidity? Whereas you, for example, the high acidity of someone that would be an individual or species that would be more carnivorous kind of has like different types of teeth that don't really correlate with that. Does that happen?
Well, the $64,000, I guess now it's the $1 million question, that I'm always asked is, can you use microwear to tell whether an animal ate meat, right? And the irony about it is that meat tends not to scratch teeth because it's soft and it doesn't contain a lot of abrasives. So we need to look for other kinds of proxies to see whether meat was consumed. Things like whether the teeth are sharp. We may be able to say something about meat consumption by looking at some of the other kinds of isotopes like nitrogen. But when we put, so no one proxy is going to be a smoking gun. You need to have a whole bunch of different kinds of proxies, put them together, and start to say something about diet.
Right. Yeah, that's something that I talked about in my interview with Dr. Bill Schindler. His theory is, and the book he wrote is called Eat Like a Human. And the main takeaway that I got from his book is that it's not so much the what, but it's the how. So it's not so much what foods were humans designed to eat with our limited physiology, but it's more how have ancient populations transformed a certain food to make it as bioavailable, as digestible, and as nutritious as possible. So it may be that we were limited in terms of our teeth and maybe our guts, but by fermenting something, by soaking, by sprouting something, we kind of obtain more nutrition from it.
I agree 100%.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And in terms of the meat affecting dentition, based on other proxies that you and your colleagues have looked into, do you think that maybe some parts of the fossil record or other pieces of evidence kind of underestimate how much meat we ate?
I think that the archaeological record overestimates how much meat we ate. And the main reason for that is that meat leaves an archaeological record. We've got bones at archaeological sites with cut marks all over them. Our stone tools we know are used for slicing meat. And so this puts together the sort of conventional, standard, long time scenario that we call man the hunter, right? And today, of course, we wouldn't use man the hunter, we use humans the hunters. But I think that underplays the role of plants in diet and human evolution, because the archaeological record is pretty silent to plants. We don't typically find plants in the archaeological record because they disintegrate over time, whereas bones do not. So in fact, I would say that if anything, our estimates of plants, is at least for those species that have an archaeological record that includes the bony remains of our prey, plants are underestimated.
And what are your thoughts on how much, I guess it's a really difficult question probably to answer, but how much plants or how much meat? Because like you said, it's always seen as like meat is what's made us human, like cooking meat is what's made us human, and it's expanded our brains. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have a different take on this entirely. And I would argue more closely to what your previous guest would argue, which is it's not meat that made us human. It's not plants that made us human. It's not fire that made us human. The role that food processing or our ability to take a broad spectrum of foods played in human evolution is it allowed us to expand, right? So I think that sort of what makes us human in terms of diet is our ability to take a very, and you mentioned a narrow spectrum of foods. I would disagree. I would say that we've got an incredibly broad potential diet compared to any other primate species in the world, compared to almost any species as it is. Our ability to take a very broad spectrum of foods is what allowed us to take over the world. How could we leave Africa? How could we go to the Arctic? How could we go to the Antarctic? How could we go to the equator if we didn't have the ability to find something to eat there? Different foods are available in different places, and our incredible ability to take a broad spectrum of food items, I believe, is one of the keys to our success. It's what makes us human, really. I think that stone tools, I think that cooking with fire, I think that these other softening approaches that you mentioned, I think other methods of detoxifying items, our ability to find something to eat, some way to fuel our bodies, just about anywhere we find ourselves, is sort of the role that food plays in human evolution. And that plays into the question, again, another question I'm asked, which is sort of what was the ancestral human diet? And I would have to argue there is no single ancestral human diet, and that any diet that limits what we eat is not going to be what we evolved for.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially nowadays when everyone in the ancestral health space is trying to, either say keto was the ancestral diet or paleo was the ancestral diet. The carnivore diet's now a thing, right? And the vegan diet's kind of also huge the past few years. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense that the truth, as with many things, often falls somewhere in the middle. And in this case, it's more so the fact that we evolved to be very flexible in terms of our diet, which is what I'm hearing you say is like a huge part of it, right? We were able to survive in really cold climates and hunt megafauna when they were available. We were able to also, forage for plants and their populations. Like I've seen some of your research and other videos and interviews you've had, and there are populations that do the exact opposite, right? They just eat like a lot of plant foods and a lot of carbohydrates. So that's the hallmark of being human, I think.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, when you start to think about it, everybody has their sort of go-to traditional and traditional group to view as the ancestral human diet type. For some people, it's the Eskimos, or the Inuit, now we would call them, who get their entire diet from meat, basically, marine mammals and fish. Whereas for others, it's the San of the Kalahari, the traditional group that gets 70% of their calories from sugary melons and starchy roots. So again, I think that the fact that all of these diets work and we can function on them is really extremely telling, really extremely telling.
Right. A question that just came up as you were saying that. So the flexibility of us kind of as a species, I've had some people on to talk about nutrigenomics. So how our like single nucleotide polymorphisms in different like populations of people kind of allow us to fare better on certain diets potentially. The field of nutrigenomics is still like really, really young, but that's the theory. And so I mean, I'm having my DNA sequenced soon. So I'm kind of excited to see if there are any, in your opinion, kind of value to seeing what your ancestors, your more immediate ancestors ate and how that affects you.
Sure. And in fact, there's very little doubt that your ancestry does impact your ability to digest different kinds of foods. Some groups, some people are people of Middle Eastern descent whose ancestors were pastoralists. And these are people who consumed a lot of milk products. They're not going to tend to be lactose intolerant, whereas people whose ancestry does not include pastoralism, say we talked about the San and the Kalahari, they will more likely be lactose intolerant, right? Because their ancestors never had to drink the lactose secretions of other mammals as adults. It doesn't make much sense from an evolutionary perspective to be able to, I mean, it takes energy to continue to produce the enzyme, the lactase that's used to break down milk sugar into adulthood, right? So if you're going to continue to do that into adulthood, it's from an evolutionary perspective, it's kind of weird, right? Why would you want to drink the milk of another mammal, especially as an adult? You're not designed to drink milk as an adult. But some people have evolved that ability. They don't shut down the ability to digest milk sugar. The amylase gene is another classic example. People with an agricultural ancestry, particularly those that have traditionally farmed for wheat products, they have more copies of the amylase gene, which breaks this stuff down, than do those that don't have an agricultural ancestry. So there's very little doubt that ancestry can play into how well we digest different kinds of foods. People have different genetic profiles.
Right. And I'm thinking also, as we become more and more interconnected, I mean, we can basically travel anywhere in the world now in less than a day. If this sort of, immediate ancestry that we had, our grandparents, our great grandparents, great great grandparents, how much will that actually matter if, we're marrying someone that's on the other side of the globe and then their genes are mixing together? What kind of an effect might that have?
I think it's awesome. I mean, there's no way to predict because there's conservation of genetics. Every 2 children you have is going to have, on average, your entire genome. So if you were to have 2 children with someone else, your genes are going to be preserved, both you and this other individual's genes. But I mean, recombination is what life is all about, right? The whole idea of mixing that adds just different combinations of genotypes of genetic profiles. It really, I think, enriches populations, right? If for example you're insular and you always sort of choose to mate within your group, that's going to be really limiting. And I mean, if you want to avoid homozygous recessive diseases that you get because both of your parents have the gene for it, the best way to do that is to marry someone from the other side of the world that doesn't have that gene.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting when we start to get more widely available testing for DNA and just seeing all the different unique mixes of these SNPs.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I mean, I've done ancestry.com, and that stuff's really cool. I'm not sure that we are yet at the point where we've got all the genes related to diet sequenced that are relevant. And my guess is that they're not doing enough of the DNA sequence to pull that stuff out anyway. But yeah, it would be pretty cool. And there is a big future in genomics. There's also a big future in gut microbiome research. Looking at sort of the profile of the bacteria that are inside your gut and what those are sort of designed, if you want to use the term, or have evolved to break down.
Right. Yeah. And there's also some evidence that I saw. I'm actually having Dr. Laura Wayrick, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, but she found that there's, through the dental biofilm, she kind of found like bacteria that could tell you some things about the diet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm real familiar with her research.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating stuff. One other question, one kind of controversy I wanted to ask you. So again, going back to what we hear all over social media and the ancestral health space, a lot of people are saying that the transition towards agriculture meant that we had, more of a reliance on plant foods, and which are sometimes referred to as fallback foods. And they argue that this led to a decrease of our size of our jaws, the density of our skulls, and even the size of our brains. So is there some truth to that? And are all those things necessarily a bad thing?
Good question. One area of very active research, particularly in dentistry, is what they call now sleep dentistry, right? And that the people who work in that area are very active in airway studies and how changes in ancestral diets have impacted our airways. So by your smile, I can see that you're familiar with this. And I get interviewed by folks about this kind of stuff all the time. I've spoken to lots of study groups of dentists who are interested in sleep dentistry and airway studies. And it's absolutely true that generations ago, our jaws were longer. We tended not to have crooked and crowded teeth. Because our jaws were longer, our teeth fit them properly. And that stressing those jaws is what stimulates them to grow to their potential length, right? When you were a baby, when most of your listeners were babies, they probably were fed baby food, right? Sort of mashed yams and those awful little glass jars of things. And in fact, my kids were too. And I kept yelling at not yelling, but I kept telling my wife, stop feeding them this. Give them some beef jerky. Give them something to chew on. I, of course, lost that argument because she said she'd rather them have crooked teeth than choke to death. But nevertheless, there's no question that early people put a lot more force on their jaws when they were chewing because they had to chew tougher and harder foods than the highly refined and processed foods we eat today while those jaws were developing. And as any sort of bone scientist can tell you, when you repeatedly load bone, it stimulates the cells, the osteoblasts that secrete bone, to do that, right? And when those cells secrete bone, the length of the jaw, the whole size of the jaw grows to match the size of the teeth. That's important for sleep dentistry. The problem, because of your airway. Yeah, it's kind of difficult. I mean, having crooked and crowded teeth can be bad. It can lead to cavities. It can lead to impacted molars. It can lead to, well, you know, a lot of people don't think sort of crooked and crowded teeth is attractive, and it can lead to problems with chewing. And those are problems in and of themselves, but perhaps an even larger problem is the fact that a smaller jaw means a smaller oral cavity, less room in the mouth for your tongue. And your tongue size is pretty constant. That's not going to change. So if there's not enough room in your mouth for your tongue, you're not going to be able to breathe quite as well. Especially at night, your tongue's going to slip to the back of your throat because your jaw's not long enough to contain it. And you're going to have sleep apnea. And this is a huge avenue for research. It's not necessarily related to our ancestral diets, but it's certainly probably related to changes that occurred with the refinement and softening of foods during, say, the Industrial Revolution, when we started eating like peanut butter sandwiches, right? And in
Right.
fact, if you look, there have been studies that have been done in India, rural versus urban. People of India that eat softened urban foods, you know, chapati and lentils and things like that that are cooked, their teeth, their jaws are shorter, their teeth are more crowded, and they don't have the airway space than their cousins who are living out in more rural parts of India that have access, that have tougher foods, less refined and processed foods. And this story goes on over and over again. We see it from one generation to the next of the Pima peoples out of the American Southwest. One generation, jaws were great. Next generation, canneries came in, processed foods, jaws shrank. We see it in the rural peoples of Kentucky, right? The traditional peoples in the backwoods of Kentucky, their teeth were great. The jaws were perfect length, but their kids who started to rely on processed and refined foods, they didn't hunt and gather themselves and didn't grow themselves. Again, you start to see this change. It occurs over and over again in all kinds of populations. So in that sense, yeah, there's very little question that changes to our diets in the recent past have had an impact on our biology that have affected both our oral health, incidence of cavities, shortened jaw, and even our breathing.
So part of the story is with the lack of like the mechanical stimulation of kind of developing the jaw muscles during development.
It's not the jaw muscles, it's the jaw bone.
The jaw bones, right.
It's the jaw bone itself. If you look, you know, I mean, there's a reason that they tell older women who are prone to bone loss that they should go out and exercise and jar their bones, because that's going to stimulate the cells that produce more bone to produce more bone. When you jar something, when you smack your bone, when you put stress on a bone, that bone responds by making more bone to strengthen itself. Right? And if that occurs during development, the ultimate length of your bone depends upon how much stress you put on it while you're growing.
Okay, so part of that is just kind of stimulating the bone, not so much the muscle, to develop and grow more, to allow more room for the tongue, to allow more room for teeth.
Yeah, I bet you that 90% of your listeners have had either impacted or non-forming wisdom teeth, have had lower front teeth that are sort of pushed together and have had upper front teeth that jut out in front of the lowers rather than edge to edge. I bet you do. I know I do. And that would not have been the case in our ancestors, people with the same genetics that didn't have such highly refined and processed foods in our diets.
Yeah, I definitely had to take my wisdom teeth out because I didn't have room. But luckily it actually went well, but can't speak for most of my friends who did have them impacted.
And in fact, I talk about that with my own daughter in a recent Scientific American paper that I wrote. And here's a little secret for your listeners. The image in there of the jaw with the impacted wisdom teeth, that's my daughter's jaw. We were able to get permission to reprint it.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating field of study. And I think there is also another argument that I've heard. I had Dr. Joel Gould on the podcast as well, and he talks about like Weston A. Price's work. And they kind of argue more towards, like the importance of nutrients, like, for example, like vitamin K2 and D3 that, K2 is mostly found in like organ meats, for example. And it's kind of been missing from the diet in a lot of ways because most people kind of think it's gross or they're not sure how to cook it. And in addition to what you said about harder foods, they think that there's a nutrient aspect to this. What are your thoughts on that?
Could be. That's sort of outside my wheelhouse. I'm not an expert in that area. I would say that from an evolutionary perspective, all that our ancestors cared about was getting enough calories to get through the next day. Right? That was what it was about. It was not about, well, how am I going to survive in my old age?
Right.
I can have bone loss in my old age. Nobody cared about that. It was, let me get another day. And when you have to forage for your own food, you're not saying, all right, well, do I need to go for the eland with the big old liver, or do I need to go for the baobab fruits with the whatever nutrient, name your nutrient? That's not what they're thinking. They're thinking, how can I fill my belly so that I can survive for the next day?
Right.
And, and in fact, if you look at the age profiles of our fossils, and these are the animals at the age that they died fairly young. So if your goal is to survive, say, into sort of a post-reproductive age, there's not really an evolutionary way of getting there because we're not designed for that.
Right. Yeah. And I think the question that comes up for a lot of people at this point is, like, of course, we had to just look for calories first. That was like the most important thing. But then people kind of are now asking the question, what was optimal and what is optimal? And from some previous interviews that I've had, they seem to think that because, for example, meat is something that's, hundreds or even, I think it's hundreds of times more calorically dense per, time that you spend foraging than plants, that's something that was favored.
Well, it's not hundreds of times more calorically dense than plants, given time spent foraging. I can tell you from my own experience with the Hadza hunter-gatherers of Tanzania, and from reports from other hunter-gatherers, the San of the Kalahari, hunter-gatherers in the New World and the Amazon, as often as not, or even more often than not, they come home with nothing, right? I mean, these men will go out and they will spend hour after hour after hour, and they often fail to bring back food. The women who sit around the camp digging up tubers, they're the ones that feed the family most of the time. And while calorically, per unit volume, meat may be denser, the amount of energy expended to get the meat generally doesn't justify the amount of time spent searching for it. So yes, if somebody hands you an antelope you can get more out of it than if somebody hands you a whole bunch of roots. But it's an awful lot easier. Roots don't run away to get the roots. And more often than not, that's what's going to feed the family.
I've heard from several people that have visited the Hadza as well that their reservations are kind of slowly getting smaller and smaller, and they're not having access to hunting larger animals as they used to before.
Well, this is a good point, and it's a valid point. The surviving foragers of the world, there are fewer and fewer. And to be honest with you, the Hadza are just about gone now. The Tanzanian government has been working hard to sedentize them. There are probably more researchers out studying Hadza than there are Hadza in the bush today. Well, it's probably an exaggeration, but not a great exaggeration. Most of the traditional foragers that we study are those that live in marginal environments, because those that lived in lusher environments have moved on to raising animals and planting foods. And those people who are currently still foraging have been moved into more sort of marginal environments, whether it's the desert or the open savanna or the high Arctic. Yeah, there are some that are still in rainforest settings, like in the Amazon, but even there, it can be challenging without technology to farm and raise animals. So that is a point. I mean, you do have a point, but I think under all circumstances, hunting is hard. And all you need to do is look at the success rates of carnivores that live in places where there's plentiful meat to understand that a deer is going to have a much more reliable source of food than a lion is. If you're a deer or if you're a cow, all you have to do is lower your head, open your mouth, and start chewing, and there's food right in front of you, right? That lion is going to more often than not fail to secure an animal who's running away from it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That's something that I had Dr. Bendor on the podcast. That's something that didn't really come up as much. So it came up that it could be, per volume, like you said, more calorically dense because of the fat. But the point about how much energy it takes to bring the animal down, to butcher it, to start a fire, to gather the wood for that. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Herman Ponzer has taught us that it's not simply a matter of calories in, calories out, because exercise is a terrible way to lose weight. Because in fact, I use just before this interview, I was on my stationary bike on Zwift, and over the course of about an hour, 45 minutes, I was able to burn the equivalent number of calories as one slice of pizza, which is very disheartening for all that effort. But nevertheless, if your success rate in hunting is really low, you're not getting a lot of calories out of it for the effort you're putting in.
Right.
It's not what we call optimal foraging.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. So the final question that I wanted to ask you is, what needs to be further investigated in your opinion, and what would you and your colleagues like to further investigate to keep answering the question of what humans evolved to eat?
Well, I think what we need to do is we need to continue along the line of looking for new food prints, to understand more about what animals really in the past ate on a daily basis as our fossil record improves. And it is improving because there's lots of people, COVID aside, going out and finding new fossils all the time. We need to continue to find new tools to study them. We need to continue to come up with new ways of getting at more details. So for example, we look at different kinds of isotopes. We come up with more innovative ways of extracting proteins and DNA from the tartar that we find inside the teeth. We come up with better ways of looking at the oral microbiome by looking at the teeth. When I got into this field like 30 years ago, there was nothing. None of this stuff that I've talked to you about today even existed. The microware was extremely limited. The isotopes had not really been done on the hominins. And we knew nothing. But the amount of information, the detail has been growing in leaps and bounds, and there are more and more people working on newer and more innovative ways of getting at more detail. And I think that's probably our most fruitful direction, at least at the moment.
And where can people find out more about you and your work? I'll link to your books, of course, in the show notes, but any other links you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, there's Evolution's Bite is sort of just sort of describes my research and how that evolved, how I came to do what I do. I've got a couple of articles in Scientific American that are kind of fun and useful. And you can feel free to visit my website, ungarlab.uark.edu, to find out a little bit more about what I'm doing today and the folks in my lab.
Amazing. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.